Okay guys, hello and welcome back to another video. And today, we're going to be talking about reading. So reading is something that is a really weird one. I've had a really weird relationship with reading. I think it's a really key skill with self-improvement. But I've made the mistake in the past of viewing it in completely the wrong way. And I think a lot of people do. However, recently I've started to read in a very different way, and I've got through a lot more books to start off with, and reading's a lot more pleasurable than it has ever been before. To get myself to read in the past has almost always been a chore and something very little reward. For the first time in my life, I'm really tapping into what is enjoyable about reading. I'll sit and read for my own enjoyment. Now, this isn't actually the reason I read. I'm reading primarily to understand something about the world, to learn. But it is an interesting side effect that in doing this, I've become very interested. I really enjoy reading. So I'm going to go over what I think is the best ways to get yourself into reading. And more importantly, I'm going to talk about why you should read in the first place. So we'll start with why you should read in the first place, because I think that's the thing that people really need to get. It's funny, I think with a lot of things, if you can't do it, and then you see someone else do it, it looks very impressive. If you see someone who has the money to buy a very expensive car, let's say, you might think that's terribly impressive, and because it's something you can't do, right? If you see a guy having lots of women, sleeping with lots of women in a very casual basis, you might think, wow, that's really impressive, because you can't do it. Or I don't know, you might be able to, but in this example. It's the same with reading. If you see someone who can read, does a lot of reading, and just reads for pleasure, you look at him, certainly I look at him and I just think, wow, that's amazing. That's amazing. And you want what he has. But in all these instances, we're not really asking the right question, because it doesn't really matter whether you can or can't do it. What matters is, what does that add to your life? What does it add to your life to have a really fast car that's really expensive? What does it add to your life to have lots of casual sex with lots of attractive women? What does it add to your life to be able to be dissolved in a book? And I think the interesting thing is, a lot of people will set their eyes on particularly the first two things I mentioned, the women and the money and the cars and that kind of stuff. They'll go out and get it, and they'll realise how empty it really is. And they're like, why do I even want this in the first place? Now, that doesn't mean it's not a good motivation. That doesn't mean there aren't good things about it, about that stuff that I described. But it's worth illustrating that you want to get your story straight on why exactly you want the thing that you can't have. You're watching this video, I presume, because you struggle to read. You struggle to stay focused on a book. You struggle to get through a book, and you think if you watch this video it's going to help. But just before we get any progress in it, just take a moment to think, why do you actually want to read in the first place? What is motivating you? And is it just because it looks impressive that people can read for a very long period of time? That's something to really bear in mind, because for a long time I got into the habit of reading, where I'd read a little bit of a book every day, and I had some good tactics that we'll talk about later about how I was able to get into the habit of reading and all that stuff's coming. But even with these tactics in place, I wasn't really getting anything out of reading. I was reading consistently, I was making progress in reading. But there was no real reason why I was reading, and I wasn't really getting that much pleasure out of it. And now recently that's changed because I read with a very different focus. And now I don't really worry about the sort of small tactics that have helped me along the way to keep consistent. Now I still do them, and that's great. But the important thing is I've got the reason why I read in the first place. And that's the thing I want to get at. You have to choose. Basically, what happened with me is I'd see someone reading a book in a cafe or on the side of a pool or something like that, and I'll just think, wow, that's amazing that they can do that. Isn't that cool? I want to be able to do that. But that's not really enough. That's not really enough. And I started reading basically with a very different aim in mind. And that aim was to learn about the world. So prior to this point, I was reading lots of books, lots of novels basically. I wanted to read novels. And I think reading novels is really important. But it's much harder to tap into, because you need stories. Everyone needs stories. But the advantage of switching to reading non-fiction, which is what effectively I'm doing now, is much easier to gain information. You're rewarded for your efforts much more quickly. So I basically switched my aim. So now I was reading with a purpose, and the purpose was to gain information, which I was doing quite a lot. And that is what keeps me reading. If I'm not learning from what I'm reading, I don't bother finishing the book. It's very important to me that what I'm reading has applicable function in the real world. And when you start reading like that, it really changes the dynamic and the experience of you reading, because you're the one in charge. You're the one who expects something from the book to make it exciting, rather than you are trying to understand what is exciting about what you're reading. It's a much better dynamic. Okay, so that's the big changes. I have a real purpose when I'm reading. The purpose is to learn something from what I'm reading, and if I don't learn from it, then I don't bother finishing the book. Now, that is the focus that I take. You might find that there's something else. You might find that you just want to get pleasure out of what you're reading. But whatever it is, you want to have something more than just you want to get good at reading. Because there's no point in just being good at something for the sake of it. And even if there was, you make better progress when you have an aim before it to get you good at it, right? So that's the first thing to remember. Now, I'll run over some tactics quickly that have helped me stay consistent with reading. And the first thing is quite simply just to stay consistent, to read every day. And no matter how small whatever your reading is. So if you've got a busy schedule and you can only read 1 page a day, that's fine. Start with that, because that's much better to read 1 page a day than to have 1 day a week where you read 10 pages. It says a lot more, I think, if you can stay consistent to a habit than throughout the week, than to 1 day a week read to just do the habit, but a little bit more than you would if you were doing it every day. So find a way to stay consistent, and don't worry if that means you don't do very much reading. Really just focus on the habit forming. So I like to do it in the morning. I associate reading very strongly with drinking coffee, so I will do it first thing in the morning and I'll have a coffee with it. And something about that just really cements the habit in my mind. I begin to look forward to it. And so maybe that's something you could try. The next thing to say is to don't worry about having multiple books on the go at the same time. That's one area of your life where I think you're allowed to have multiple things on at one time. So I'm reading 3 or 4 books at the moment, and the only reason I'm not reading more is because others haven't arrived yet. Like, I honestly think you can just read, Hamza recommends about 10 books is the right amount. And this, far from diluting your attention, expands I think you get more out of it by doing it this way because you can really focus in on what really grabs you in the moment. Now, if you get to the point where you're just reading an ever-growing list, it gets into the hundreds of books or whatever, you find you're losing track of what you're reading. Okay, maybe take it down a bit, but I think having anywhere to 5 to 10 books that you're reading at the same time, it's not a problem, and you'll find it's a lot more interesting doing that if you've just been someone who's read just one book your entire life. And it goes back to what we were saying earlier about how you want what you're reading to be interesting, right? So that's the next thing. The third thing is, don't be afraid to stop a book halfway through if you stop learning from it. Again, it's really fuzz in the face of what we're taught at school, but I think you want to be quite ruthless about what you're reading. You don't want to wear yourself out by details that aren't really important, because otherwise what's the point? So even if it's like a chapter that you're not really interested in, don't be afraid to skip over it. The important thing is what you are reading is giving you value. And the other thing is, if you skip out a chapter here and there, or a few paragraphs here and there, you can always come back to the book later, revisit it properly, and then read the chapter and come back to it. So don't see skipping any part because you're not really interested, that's not really relevant to you, or whatever it is. I don't see that as a bad thing. I think that's intelligent reading. You're being selective about what you're choosing to consume. So that's fine as well. And the other thing is, rereading is a great thing. Don't expect to digest everything that you read on the first encounter. It's great if you do, but I think a lot of the time, and I particularly think this a lot at the moment, a lot of the books that I've been reading I'm going to come back to later, and I think I'll understand them a lot more after I've read other books and learned the lessons that I've already learned from them, and then come back to the book afresh and reread it again, and then learn even more. So that's my tips for reading effectively, and hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one.